So, Jonathan, first of all, thank you very much for accepting this invitation to talk to us. Here we are, two groups of writing classes. I've been teaching creative writing for these people for about 5, 6 years. It's a continuous course. We never interrupt. We're always inventing new subjects to write about, to read about. It's a workshop in which we both read and write. So every bimester, we select a topic and we read about this topic, both theory and practice. And so we read many writers who've been influenced by other writers, and we analyze how this influence occurred. And as I'm saying, this bimester, we're studying influence,
Mm-hmm. That's
right?
true. Yeah.
And so the first thing we did was to read your essay, and we analyzed it. We talked a lot about it. And then afterwards, we've started reading texts that have been influenced by other writers.
Mm-hmm.
So, people, do you remember the first one we read this bimester?
I think it was Jonathan Lethem.
I know, of course. But then afterwards, what did we read? We read Guimarães Rosa. I don't know if you've ever heard about him. It's one of our main writers here in Brazil. And Guimarães Rosa is about to be translated again into English in January next year. His book is being translated by Alison Entrekin. And he was influenced by Homer, by the chivalry novels from the Middle Ages. And so we've seen how these influences happened in his work. And today we're here happy to receive you. Well, we have a simultaneous translator who's translating everything you're going to say into Portuguese, so people don't have that much difficulty listening to you.
Yeah. So will
So,
they will they be seeing it as text going or hearing it in a translation in their ears?
no, in their ears.
Yeah. Fantastic. Great.
Okay.
Sorry, I
So,
don't speak Portuguese, so I can't
well,
oblige you that.
well, that's it. We're here to listen to you and to welcome you here to Brazil.
Good. Thank you. Well, so first of all, I've never actually been to Brazil. Been to some other parts of Central and South America and elsewhere in the world, but I haven't been fortunate enough to visit Brazil. Although I think I have one or two books translated into Brazilian Portuguese, at least a couple. Um, I want to be certain. When you say you've read my essay, what you mean is the ecstasy of influence. The one.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
great. So, what I want to do is first talk a little bit about the existence of that essay. Excuse me, and and also what it omits in a sense, because as large as that piece of writing is, it's also all depends upon this very particular construction where I'm borrowing other people's words. So there's a a strange way in which everything is in that essay that I wanted to say, but nothing that comes really personally from my own intimate experience of making texts, making art. So when I wrote that, the conditions were very particular. I was participating, in a sense, in a moment when a number of American intellectuals and artists were very focused on the idea of appropriation and copyright and intellectual property because it had been abused, I think, by corporate owners of artistic works and expanded so drastically that it was no longer serving the purposes of individual artists. And the obvious example, which I used in the piece, the one that everyone recognizes, is the way that the American legal system kept making copyright last a little bit longer every time there was any danger that Mickey Mouse would move into the public domain and that the Disney Corporation would lose control of Mickey Mouse. But this was a representation of something that was true in general, which is that record companies, publishers, film studios had been expanding the idea of control, permanent control of intellectual property, to the detriment, it seemed to me, to the loss for creators of the incredibly valuable collective and welcoming reservoir called the public domain or the commons. And that this was becoming shrunken and eaten away by this desire to control everything. And one of the things that accompanied this legal and corporate transformation, was an exaggeration of the individuality of artists. It was being suggested that every artist simply made up their work from nowhere, that it just existed as a pure expression, and that originality was the truth of creativity. And I felt strongly that it was the opposite, that the interdependence of different texts or images, that the responsiveness and influence and connections between different books, different films, different songs, and our freedom to acknowledge this and to make use of it, to be involved in it, was very basic to being an artist of any kind, a writer or a painter or a filmmaker. And of course, there were, just as there was these examples of, you know, creative objects like Mickey Mouse that were being protected so strongly um, by these laws, there were other examples of artists who were suffering uh, the injustice of having their practice made more difficult for them or sometimes made impossible by the ideas and the laws that suggested that um, appropriation or influence or intertextuality, that these things weren't okay, that they were bad. And a really strong example, someone I met during this time was the um, American hip hop artist Hank Shockley, who was a member of Public Enemy. And he was a genius at sampling music, taking little pieces of other people's music and turning them into something completely amazing that had never existed before. But the record companies freaked out and they inspired new laws that made Hank Shockley's practice as an artist completely impossible. He could no longer do his art. And this is an extreme example. But in between, I think it was a real disservice. It was doing a real disservice to practitioners of all kinds to constantly be told, you have to put a fence around your work and get very upset if anyone ever borrows or responds to it or imitates it. And it's important to make sure you never are influenced in any way that anyone can detect or prove, because you have to exaggerate this idea of pure originality. And it seemed to me completely mistaken. Just as all of our experiences, all of our life on earth are made up of the things that happen between us and among us, uh, speech, behavior, the life of a family, the life of a community, everything is interdependent. The world of the arts also seemed to me to be truly interdependent this way. That we were we were all part of something together that was much bigger than any individual practice or idea. And there were artists who I loved who seemed to me um, to be perfect examples of this. You know, I think one that's very useful, very interesting is Bob Dylan, who, you know, scholars and critics have combed through his songwriting for 50 years now and found references to everything, borrowings from everywhere, sometimes completely unacknowledged because he doesn't like to give interviews and he doesn't like to explain himself. And he's been accused of theft hundreds and hundreds of times. And yet, no one who really listens to his work could ever imagine that these songs would exist without his individual voice and passion. You know, the things he makes out of what he takes from elsewhere are completely astonishing. And if he hadn't lived to do this work, those songs would never exist. So in someone like Bob Dylan, you see it's both both sides of the coin, that his originality, his expression depends upon his freedom to make reference, to be influenced, to borrow, or if you like to call it stealing, to steal. That there's no other way that he could have made the work that he made. And this is how I feel about my own experience as a writer. Writing comes from reading. I love that you describe your class as being a reading and writing class because this is too often kept separate. You know, I teach creative writing, and the very first day, every time I say, I can't really teach you this practice. You already know it from reading, or if you're not a reader, there's nothing I can do to help you. But it's the texts that we take into our brains that create our capacity to generate sentences and make new things happen in the realm of literature. So I'm I'm speaking from my own experience. When I began to write, I was automatically making reference to things that I loved. I was openly imitating them. And, you know, as I say in that essay, uh, a lot of traditional ideas, pre-modern ideas about how an artist acquires their practice uh, have to do with copying. Musicians copy other musicians. Painters go to museums and put the easel in front of the great masters and try to make a version of the same painting. And I think almost every writer begins with imitation, really sometimes very charmingly direct and, um, uh, undisguised imitation. You know, I I think, uh, there are certain texts that inspire younger readers in a very particular way, and if you go into the stories of the formation of so many different writers, they begin to talk about the same handful of influences. They begin to talk about reading Sherlock Holmes stories or, reading Tarzan stories or or reading Wuthering Heights and wanting first to just make something that was like this thing that they'd adored, that resembled it. And I myself was this way very, very simply. I loved detective stories. I loved science fiction stories, and, I liked surrealism. But this points to something else that I wasn't able to talk about as directly in that essay because as I say, the essay is made up of other people's it has this trick that it does where I don't really appear. I substitute other people's words for my own. Um, my own story is very specific, and it is that I was trained in the visual arts first. My father is a painter. He's 94 years old and he's still making paintings. And he his kept his studio in the top floor of the house where I grew up. And I was drawing and painting before I was a writer. For a long, long time, I thought that was what I was going to do. And I was also going to museums and going to galleries as much as I was reading books. So a lot of my ideas about writing, I think, come from my experience in the world of visual arts. And from my training, because I ended up going to art school for high school in America. High school is where you are when you're 14, 15, 16 years old. And I went to a special high school for visual art. And I was making paintings and drawings before I was trying to make stories or novels. So when I work as a writer, I still think in some ways as a painter. And in painting, I think, especially in the 20th century, this idea of influence and response and appropriation, these things are impossible to disguise. If you look at the all the great art movements of the 20th century, practically in Western art, um, with maybe the one exception of totally abstract expressionist painting. But if you look at surrealism, if you look at, you know, Picasso, if you look at pop art, all of these things explode with references to other things, references to images from popular culture, references to film, um, collages are very crucial. You have Andy Warhol painting advertising images. And so this idea that you make reference to external things, you don't create totally isolated objects, but your objects are connected to the world, to me seems so basic, so fundamental to the kind of expressive world I wanted to enter when I began to switch and do writing. So I felt very free about appropriation and influence because it seemed to me just um, almost silly to try to pretend that I wasn't interested in the things I was interested in. They were all around me. They were the books on my shelves, and I was writing in a relationship to them. I was writing in response to them. They gave me energy. They gave me um, uh, ideas and formal um, notions, structures, and I knew that I wanted to change them, transform them, make them more personal to me, and that the tension between this desire to express one's unique feelings and to use the language that of culture that is everywhere around us was going to produce energy and meaning. So I was always a writer who was very eager to point to my own influences. Um, Sometimes it would surprise me how much people still seem to be um, inhibited against doing this. You know, who would that they would kind of try to keep them uh, behind a curtain. It seemed to me more interesting and more exciting to the vernacular phrases to wear them on my sleeve, you know, to put them forward and let people talk with me about, you know, oh, so you're interested in Raymond Chandler. That's why you wrote about this kind of private detective character. You know, now you're interested in Don DeLillo. That's why you're writing about these scientists on a uh, academic campus. And all of these conversations, they were precisely the conversations I wanted to have. And I think in many cases, they're the kinds of conversations that writers and artists have when they're alone together, when they're in more private spaces at dinner or in one another's studios. But um, they are less likely to have the same conversation when when they're talking to someone who's interviewing them for print or something. They're more likely to play that game of kind of uh, pretending not to know what it was they were influenced by. So this became a kind of a sport for me in a way, like a practice. Like, let me just always try mentioning it. And I think that created a situation where I was sometimes separating myself slightly from from other people, and um, I would be called a magpie or a a, a pastiche artist, someone who always borrowed and always made reference. But I never felt that the difference was in my work. I felt the difference was in how I talked about my work. So when I wrote this essay, it was also a message not only to, people who wanted to think about these legal structures, but it was a kind of challenge to my fellow writers to say, what if we were more honest about this? Because I suspect strongly that everyone is involved in the same kind of um, response and continuous flow of influences and and reactions to other people's language, if you're a writer, or other people's images or other people's films. And uh and that there was just a kind of a gentle conspiracy, I guess you would call it, to to pretend that originality was more um generally uh, more total a situation than it really was. Um and now one of the things that I also felt was that um this went together with something else that was very important to me in my work, which was, even in this talk with you already, I've mentioned films and music, and I'm not exclusively influenced by novels and stories. My own writing is very strongly affected by other kinds of art that I take in. And sometimes I'm writing something has a very powerful relationship to a Stanley Kubrick movie or or to, you know, an album that I've been listening to. And even though those are not forms that I work in, I think the transmission across these boundaries is very a very important part of my writing life. And I would also say that the same thing, this breaking down of the boundaries and noticing the connections between things really also goes together for me personally with uh, the problem or the situation of genres, the separation that has been usually traditionally kept between one kind of writing and another kind of writing, between some genres that are regarded as more popular or less literary. And I always was very interested in mixing those things up, making them talk to each other.
Mhm.
And this even characterized my relationship to other kinds of um, media that were often taken even less seriously. If within the world of writing, uh, you know, a novel by Thomas Pynchon is taken very seriously, and a novel by Philip K. Dick or Ursula Le Guin is treated a little separately. At least they're both novels. But I was also interested in writing fiction that was influenced by comic books or by advertising, by parts of our culture that are speaking to me that are not regarded as high art forms at all. And I think we live in a world of culture and influence, and that these forms are all talking back and forth. It doesn't mean they're all of equal value. The results uh, might be inconsequential, but there is often a transfer of energy or images or possibilities between high and low forms, between different genres, between um, things that are regarded as art and things that are traditionally excluded from art. So this also meant, for instance, since I grew up in New York City, I was very interested in graffiti art, which was a kind of almost like illegal practice. It was like advertising created by people who weren't invited to create advertising. Billboards painted by fugitives. And but it still seemed to me to have cultural energy and meaning, and it connected to my own impulse to express myself. And so I've tended to search for these um, many levels at which I can be influenced, and I can identify my influence and say that these things are reaching me and I want to talk back to them. In American popular music, there's the idea that which comes from, I think, originally uh, from black music, from church music and gospel music, and also from the songs that prisoners would sing in the fields when they were made to do forced labor, which is the call and response. That everything is more interesting when there's one voice throwing itself and getting something coming back to it. And of course, this, you know, becomes a version of um, certain styles of popular music. When you hear uh, Gladys Knight and the Pips sing Midnight Train to Georgia, and the backing vocalists are not just repeating what she's saying in the main lyric, but they're saying different things and asking her questions. Uh, it's electric. It's very exciting. And I think of my practice as an artist as always being made more alive by this feeling of call and response. That I throw my voice out there and I hear something, it comes back to me and I write it down or I involve myself in it or I figure out what to say back. And that this feeling of connection between the books on my shelves, um, the culture around me it makes my work surprising to me and relevant, and it connects it to things that other people might find meaningful. Um, and this I make this description as a um, antidote to the idea that the artist goes off to some sort of distant mountaintop and receives like a bolt of lightning and then comes down and just offers it to people like Moses. I have the transmission, uh, and now I'm going to share it with you. Which is a one-way transmission. I made something, or I I found something that no one else could have found or made, and it was completely my own, and I'm just going to offer it to you. And I think this is an important idea to constantly underline or repeat because um, the world of capitalism wants to isolate us, wants to break down the things that connect us and involve us in sharing practices. Now, I know, of course, when I say this, that I also create a paradox because as an actual daily habit, what I do as a writer does involve separation. I may not go to a mountaintop, but I have to sit with myself. I need to quiet the other voices for a certain period of time. And often I spend many hours alone. And the results are like an offering. They appear to fit the model of coming down from the mountaintop with the offering. But you know, I don't think that's the deeper truth. I think that's a resemblance that fools many writers into thinking that they are more independent of other human beings, independent of other texts than they really are. And, this is also why I'm very interested in um, areas where, unlike the novelist, where the artist is in a permanent interdependent practice. I wrote a novel about a rock band, and the mystery and magic of a rock band, take the simplest example that everyone recognizes, like the Beatles, is that they are more together than they were separately. There's something that happens that when they're working in the same space that belongs to all of them, but also to none of them individually. And this is also true of the genius of filmmaking, that it's fundamentally social, fundamentally collaborative, that one person must inspire the other right there in the space. The director and the actor, the cinematographer, the editor is another secret artist working afterwards, and that this collective creates these beautiful expressive objects, which again belong not completely to any one person. We often give them to the director because we have this image of individuality. And I'm very excited by the great directors, but I know that they all are so fundamentally dependent on other voices and other participations. And I think novel writing, like being Beethoven or something, like a composer, there are these practices that simply on a material level, it requires you to go alone and 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 work in isolation. But I think that the truth of our human experience, because we are social animals, we're in a collective fundamentally. The truth is the opposite. The truth is that we write our texts with a world of voices in our heads that we've gathered from books, and um and that I know I'm constantly replenishing myself by going back to the things that I need to read, and reconnecting with them. Uh and that when something goes wrong in my writing, it is often that I'm not reading enough, that I forget to go and reconnect to the things, the source materials, to go back to drink at the well. One of my favorite writers and favorite writing teachers is Samuel Delany. I don't know if he's very much known in Brazil, but he is strongly of this same view, and he expresses it very beautifully. And he has this rule, he says, when he teaches um, novel writing, where he says, um, the achievement of a given novel is probably limited by um, whether or not by the level of the best novel that the person who's writing it has read in the last 6 weeks before they begin. That that you have to constantly touch the things that amaze you and whose power um, is mysterious to you, in order to move into a space where you make something that will be mysterious and amazing to other people to read. So my feeling is that um, if it can be done with the simultaneous translation or with the help of those here who, I don't know if there are a handful of you who have some or a lot of English, but I'm sure that questions would be good, and that I will say more distinct and interesting things if I know what some of your questions might be. So, shall we try to find a way to make that
Yeah.
happen?
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. It was so fitting to everything that we've been discussing.
Glad.
It's really great. If I can start, it's not exactly a question, but I always think that the word originality, which is always connected to something new, something exclusive, something different, if we consider its etymology, it is not related to what's new, but it's related to what's old.
Yeah, right, the original. Yeah, that's great.
It's it's the origin, where you come from,
Yeah,
when you come from, right? And so I usually say that originality is actually a combination of influences.
yeah,
How
that's
you
terrific.
how you combine these influences, because every single person on earth has different influences, right? Not only regarding the books the person has read, but everything the person has lived through, right? And so originality, doing something different, is how you combine your
Mhm.
origins.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
I think that's marvelous. And yeah, it's this it's a word from biology, right? Recombinancy, but it's the idea that we can't help but be unique creatures, in the manner of the snowflakes or the fingerprints, right? But we're fundamentally in a dialogue with history, with one another, and with, we constituted of other bodies. So we're walking around in these unique forms, but we're also containers, and this is also true literally in a biological sense, right? That there are more cellular forms living inside your body that have DNA that is not your DNA than there is your own. Well, that's how our minds work. That's how our experience works. We're stitched up from all these different, elements. And so letting our active, expressive selves reflect this as well, with a sense of not avoidance or embarrassment, but jubilantly, you know, embracing it seems to me ideal.
Thank you. Who would like to ask a question? Denise, are you going to ask in English or in Portuguese?
I'm going to try to make it in English.
Okay.
Let's see if I can do it. My question is about the boundaries, if there are any. Do you think we should think of any limits for this inspiration, for this copying work that we naturally do? Because when I stop to think, for instance, about medication, I don't think maybe it's a possible comparison. But if we think about medication, they make a lot of studies to develop something, some medicine, some new medicine. In what extent could we copy that? It is
Uh,
protected somehow. But in terms of artistic works, should we protect it somehow, in some extent?
yes. Well, this goes back to some of the first part of what I said, that essay actually arose within an active conversation about legal and political ideas. And I don't want to divert us too much into legal and political territory because, one part of me, of course, understands that I make my living in the world as it's currently configured. I personally receive royalties because my works have been, at least for a period, put into copyright. And um, I also understand that in the world as it's currently configured, um, drugs are developed by private corporations that are their incentive to do this, to invent the new drug, is that they believe they will control the
Patent.
intellectual property for a period, right? So if we accept the terms of our present world, then what we will be discussing or arguing about is the duration of this control, right? Because we also know that if someone still had the control of, let's say aspirin, it would be ridiculous, right? We know that there should be a time when it stops. But you could also, of course, have a conversation, which is the one I'm reluctant to begin here. Like, should our world be configured in this way? Or should there be different ways that um, artists are rewarded for their practices, or different ways that drugs are developed? But we'll stop before I go into this possibility of configuring the world completely differently. And And I'll just say, I recognize your question. I understand your question very much. And for me, the crucial difference that must be expressed is that there are people, and this was genuinely the rhetoric that you would hear from people who wanted to privatize all expression. They would say, stealing an idea or stealing, making a, let's say, making a bootleg DVD of a movie is exactly the same thing as stealing someone's car. And this has to be refused, because even if it's very upsetting, if someone echoes your idea very closely and makes their own story around the idea, and maybe they did it in a way that's, let's say, what to call it, rude. It's just unpleasant. It's right after you made your idea, and you're not a famous person, and you feel like, why? But nevertheless, it's still, even that's not like stealing a car. It's something different, right? And pushing all the ideas of property into one space as if all property, intellectual property, is the same as other property doesn't make sense. If you make a copy, a cassette of your friend's record, well, it's true that the band didn't get the royalties for your listening to the cassette, but you didn't steal your friend's record. He still has it on his shelf. If you take the car, they don't have a car anymore. So we just have to look out for these exaggerations of people's rights to control things, perhaps. Does it make sense?
Of course it does, because it's on one way we are very happy to get in touch to all arts, all sources, and be able to use it as an inspiration. That's just wonderful. But as I was talking about, is to some extent we go into the politics
Yes.
involved in the way we live in this capitalistic society where we live.
Thank you. It's a
And
very good,
that's a lot to talk about.
yeah. But it was a very good question. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Angela, are you going to speak in English or in Portuguese?
I'll try it in English. I loved your idea of, or the way you named it as call and response, as opposed to the Moses thing, right?
Yeah.
And I see as we have like iterative cycles that go closer and closer, and then you arrive at the final result, which is your work.
Mhm.
I'm even teaching a class on that, considering research as the other people's work, but also everything you lived in your life, if you had a fall and all. And I'd like you to talk a little bit more about this cycle, how fast this goes. And before we move to your response, I'd like to mention one thing and quickly ask about your practice in creative writing classes. We just have a marvelous experience here at Noemi's school, Escrevedeira, in which we had a collective translation of American poets. We had 2 rooms. It was amazing, really amazing. Yeah, so the sense of building, discussing some little words and the meaning and building something together was great. So you see, I had 2 questions. The second one is, do you devise ways in working collectively in your classes?
Yeah, sometimes that's great. So let me talk about that first, since it's fresh, and then I'm going to go back to this little more esoteric question of the reiterative cycle, which I'm very interested in. Yes, I always like to make the students find their way to some kind of collaborative work. I think it's really rich. And also, even just in class writing, being present in your bodies together writing, I think people draw energy from this, because you know, we are social creatures, and there are many writers who fight against the isolation by simply going to a cafe to write. Or maybe, you know, if they're lucky, they go to a residency where they know other people are writing in these other rooms, and then in the evening have conversations about writing. You know, we fight the isolation in so many different ways. Even when we're fundamentally working alone on a screen or on a typewriter, the sense of other bodies in space is very nourishing for us. But to draw people into exchanges and collaborations, and also surrendering sentences or ideas one to another, trading things, can be really great practice. Um, it just breaks people out of their. I mean, I find many of the students I'm teaching in a creative writing classroom are quite young, and so you're a very sophisticated group, and you've absorbed a lot of different kinds of knowledge from life as well as from writing. But they are working often with a very simple symbolic idea that to write is to purely express oneself. And that often shrinks their practice down to a very limited um, kind of activity where they're not open to other voices or to being surprised or to being replenished or to use your wonderful word, to be recombinant. They sort of think they have to put a wall around it, which can be quite if for an 18-year-old writer who's not really very good yet and hasn't written very much yet, that can be quite silly to see, actually, quite funny. Oh, they're treating it like this is my special, you know, thing, and I've got to, only I know what I'm doing, and you have to sort of be patient with this, because it's also charming and touches your heart, but it's much better to be playful, actually, and I think many of you already know this, that actually breaking this idea of being severe and rigid and determined, but to let things happen in a spirit more of play or more conversationally is usually a more more doors open up. Even if the writing ultimately is to be quite, you know, grandiose or dark or or epic, the way one reaches this destination, I think, the way one becomes that writer should consist of more of a spirit of play and experiment. I'm really interested now. I'm just going to stay on your first part of your question in your thought about the cycles of recombinancy. And maybe in a way I've already begun to answer this, that one needs to keep feeding resources and surprise. I mean, I actually find that with my novels, whether they're long and serious ones or the relatively short and playful ones, that I really need to have something surprising come in up to the very last minute to keep my connection to it alive, so that I'm not just like a um, a woodworker with a plan to make a cabinet, and I've got the plan, and I'm just shaving down the wood trying to make it perfectly to the plan. I have to make a controlled improvisation all the way through. Even when I have some big idea and big purposes, it it on a day-to-day basis, I think I wanna keep the cycle of recombinancy, that feeling coming to the very end. Now, of course, a book can only change so much at the very end. It's most of it is become rigid like a cabinet that you've made, but I wanna feel as though anything could happen, you know? A new character could appear or a new voice or a new influence could become relevant to the work.
Okay, and I guess you're getting closer to the end, right? So you're getting closer to the result anyway. So
Yeah,
thank you for your answers.
so much. Yeah.
Danielle,
Oi, bom dia, Jonathan. Que alegria poder te ouvir.
Daniel, pera um pouquinho. Jonathan, he's going to speak in Portuguese, so you have to switch
Oh,
into English in your
do I
computer.
have? I don't know if I have.
There's in the below, there's a bar and there are 3 dots.
Yes. Okay.
Or
More.
you find it?
Yes. Interpretation.
Interpretation, put it into English.
Okay. Let's try that. Thank
And
you.
then Luis, who is here doing the translation, will speak
Oh,
in
I hear
English.
you. Yes. Great.
Okay, good. Daniel.
Bom dia, Jonathan. Uma grande alegria poder conversar com você diretamente, tão pouco tempo depois de ter lido o seu texto, O Êxtase da Influência, tão bem escrito e com um grande finale tão surpreendente, que é a citação dos elementos que o senhor usou para escrever um texto que quem está habituado a escrever por dever profissional ou por necessidade percebe o quão trabalhoso foi para produzir aquilo daquela forma tão sofisticada e bem finalizada. Eu tive navegando no seu site, onde tem os seus livros, tem inclusive músicas com suas letras, que eu fiquei bastante curioso também, saber o seu processo criativo de fazer essas letras das músicas. Mas para fazer uma pergunta focada, queria perguntar sobre a influência específica do Philip K. Dick na sua obra, porque me pareceu um aspecto muito interessante, não só da influência que ele teve sobre o senhor, mas também do fato dessa influência e da sua leitura sobre esse autor ter reposicionado esse autor na cultura norte-americana, considerando que ele era um autor pulp, né? Então, achei muito interessante esse processo. E antes de te passar a palavra, queria dizer que você tem livros publicados, 2 no português brasileiro, mas também tem outros 2 livros publicados em português de Portugal, sendo que esses 2 livros no português do Brasil são pela Companhia das Letras, a mesma editora da professora Noemi Jaffe. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. Well, so I'll I'll address a few things that I heard in your remarks, and one is that, of course, writing the ecstasy of influence, putting it together was a massive piece of work. It took me most of a year actually to assemble this piece, and it was not like other writing n- because I was using these quotations, and ironically, one of the things that people think, I called it a plagiarism, right? One of the things people think is that to take other people's words is the easiest thing you can do. It's the act of a lazy writer, but it it wasn't easy. It was the most um, scholarly and the most editorial work I've ever done. I felt in many ways I was writing a dissertation, like I deserved to be given an advanced degree after I wrote it. Um, but of course it also, had incorporated this playfulness because I knew I was pulling off a great joke. I had this thing to reveal at the end. Um, and Philip K. Dick has been important to me my entire life. I read him when I was a teenager, and he really expanded my mind. And at the time, I accepted the idea that he was a kind of a crazy writer or a marginal writer because that was the context that surrounded his work. And I didn't care. I loved it anyway, and I wanted to see if I could operate some of the similar materials. So my very first novels were extremely imitative of Philip K. Dick on the outward level. They looked and felt like Philip K. Dick, and anyone who knew his work would have easily seen that I was trying to adopt his influence. But now I'm going to tell 2 different stories from there. One is, first of all, it didn't require my advocacy to enshrine him as a serious and great American writer. The truth is that he is a serious and great American writer of a very unusual kind, obviously, but this is true of also many of the great figures in literature. They're weirdos, you know? Herman Melville is a weird person. Moby Dick is a crazy book. Edgar Allan Poe is a crazy person. And you have them in your own literature in Brazil, I'm sure. And Dick is of this nature. He's really out there, but he's also truly great. He did not need me to salvage his reputation. It was becoming slowly recognized, and I was merely involved in this transformation, which was an honor for me. Because it's also true that even though aspects of his work are quite chaotic or seem out of control, he was a great reader of novels. His influences were very traditional in many ways. He studied and read, and he was thinking about, you know, James Joyce and Charles Dickens and Kafka when he wrote. So underneath the surface, this strength emerges in his writing. These connections emerge. The other story I'll tell is that he continues to nourish my writing, although he's not, it's, you know, there are different, this is a great question in this context of this class, because there are forms of influence that are obvious and recognizable. And as I say, my first couple of novels were almost embarrassingly imitative of Philip K. Dick. On the surface, the way the characters acted, the way the plot unfolded, the kinds of surreal inventions that I employed. But in fact, although those surface elements have been changed and limited, and I've moved on to other kinds of books outwardly, his influence is still so strong in the way I write novels and think about novels. It's with me even when it's not recognizable. So there's a subliminal influence, a deep influence. And I myself, it doesn't matter. I don't need to prove this to anyone, but I know when I'm still referring to him or still drawing on his powers, even to this day, in books that don't resemble his work outwardly in any way. Thank you.
We're going to have two more questions, right? Because the time is almost up for the translator. I don't mean for us, because I think we could stay here forever, but for the translator. Norberto e Maria, quando vocês forem fazer a pergunta, vocês façam mais curtinha, tá? Para não sobrecarregar o tradutor, que eu tinha combinado 1 hora com ele e agora a gente já passou. Norb, pode falar.
Yes, of course.
Hi, Jonathan. Nice
I
to
will.
meet you. I'm going to be briefly. Here in Brazil, we have a philosophical concept called anthropophagy, coined during our modernist movement. The concept draws on the cosmology of a certain indigenous people from Brazil, who believe that consuming a defeated enemy, they could acquire some of their personal qualities, such as courage or strength. What makes this idea fascinating is the enemy, too, is honored by being devoured, in the act of enchanting rather than simple appropriation. In art, and especially in literature, I suspect you feel the same way, based on I have heard from you today and the essay I have read. I think influence work in much the same way. Writers work with something that belongs to everyone, language itself. No one invents a language alone, right? Every sentence we write is made of words, forms, and ideas, and reads from the others. Because of this, if that is my question, I wonder whether the idea of art as something purely individual overlooks its fundamentally communal nature. Wouldn't be possible to see appropriation and even what we sometimes call theft, not merely as acts of taking, but as a way of recovering the communal character already inherent in language itself? Or do you think there is a conservative force embedded in this individualistic concept of authorship that resists this idea? Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you. It's a beautifully stated question, and it recaptures much of what we've been talking about here already. And I'm very interested in this comparison, of course, to anthropology, and but I have to instinctively resist the idea that there is a attack or that there is an enemy involved. And it reminds me to tell you, when I mentioned Hank Shockley from Public Enemy, when he talked about what he regarded his practice of sampling to consist of, he used a similar but different phrase. He called it ancestor worship. So it had this similar anthropological gesture, but to take a tiny piece of a Motown song and put it into a rap song, for him, that was ancestor worship. Of course, I think this dialogue between the social, collective, the communal, and the individualistic is fundamental to literature and to the arts, but it's also fundamental to human existence. So we must nourish both sides of this simultaneously. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Maria.
Hello, Jonathan. Thank you very much for speaking to us. I've read you I've been reading you for many, many years since I was
Thank you.
young. And I think, if I remember, I was going to ask you something about artificial intelligence, but this is too long a subject. I'll leave it for another occasion, maybe. But I was just going to ask then, what's the best novel you've read in the last 6 weeks?
There's a good question.
If you have some recent influences, something that you want to share with us, just
That's great. So of course, for everyone, this question always makes all titles fly away from your head instantly. But I did just read a very interesting new novel. I'm going to I actually can recall its title, but not the author's name, and I don't know. I can't grab it quickly. But the title is so distinctive, you'll be able to find it. Of course, it's, I think, maybe only in English at this point. It's a very new novel by a writer, and I think only her second novel. It was called Helen of Nowhere. Like Helen of Troy, but it's Helen of Nowhere. And it's written somewhat in the form of a play, which was very surprising. And it has one of the great surprise endings that I've read in a long time. And it was beautiful and strange, and also had the quality of being short, something you could become obsessed with and read possibly in just one afternoon, that's always exciting when you find a book that you can read quickly. It connects you to your youthful reading when you used to devour books so quickly,
Jonathan, did you hear about this book by this Byung-Chul Han, this Korean philosopher?
I think I haven't.
It's called Deconstruction in Chinese, and he speaks about copying in China, how it is different from our idea of copying. It's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
How in China, it's okay to copy.
I'll keep my eye out for it. Yeah, of course, some of these issues that I'm wrestling with are very Western and Eurocentric.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a shame that we have to end, but everything has to end.
Yeah. Really a pleasure spending time with you. Thank you.
Yeah, we too. We're really thankful to you and also to Luis for translating everything for us. And we're going to discuss what you've spoken to us for a long time.
Great.
And I hope we can meet again sometime.
Yeah, I'd love that. I hope it can be in person. That would be the best of all.
Yeah.